That they realized that it was catching on, it was growing, it was universal, it was ecumenical, and it was basically about self-discovery, self-development. It was about nothing more than that. And
They set up the Society for Psychical Research, which was a British group, and then they sent an investigator from the Society for Psychical Research in to find out if she was a fraud or not. And it was his first case, and he concluded, quote unquote, concluded that the Ascended Masters didn't exist and that the correspondence was fraudulent.
and then later had to take it back. Later on, by the way, he refuted this. He was shown to be a fraud, and his research, I think even he himself, I know the source is somewhere, and he had to actually refute this because other specialists came in from other groups and found that it was legitimate, and then they attacked him, and he actually on paper refuted it. He actually took it back. So,
Wow.
but of course that didn't get publicized. But yeah, you're right. And don't forget, we're talking about Blavatsky, and in context, I am no fan of any of these spiritualist movements that grew out of England at the time. I think they're highly spurious. I think they were controlled by the Fabian network, and although there's no real evidence of this, I believe that this Fabian network were deeply threatened by Blavatsky because she was on to them, and they didn't want that. They didn't want an order as powerful as hers was becoming to do this. And by the time that the book I'm talking about, Secret Doctrine Volume 3, came out, they knew that she was onto them, and people would read this book, and she was now starting to comment on these people and point out who they were. And of course, this then alerted them, I think.
Did she do
And
that in the volumes 3 and 4 of the Secret Doctrine that were never published?
yeah, I think that they're very hard to find. I have one, so but it's from an out of print.
Oh
It's a
wow.
facsimile. It's not even the original. So trying to get the original of that book, I wouldn't even want to try to do that because it would probably be so expensive, even if it exists. I think years ago I actually found that it did exist, but it was hundreds of dollars or something like that. And by the way, you can prove this. You just go onto Amazon, you type in Madame Blavatsky or whatever, and you'll find that all the books, or not all, but a good many of the books that actually defend Madame Blavatsky are either out of print or very, very expensive. Where all the books that debunk her are the first ones that come up, and they're pretty much easy to get. And then second to that, I kind of mentioned this earlier, is that all the so-called critics never quote or comment from the books defending her. They write as if those books didn't exist. Now, see, I find that highly irregular. And most importantly, they don't refer to the comments that I have found that openly show that she was apolitical, and she was very much against the power of the Vatican and also the Jesuit order, and that she understood that they were Illuminati based. And people can find these quotes in my work, you see. And then if I find that others, so-called critics, are not even referring to this, but then calling her that she was herself Illuminati or that she herself was part of these organizations, that's a direct and blatant contradiction.
Wow. And do you think maybe another reason why the British set her up was because of the effect that she had on India and the she helped India in a way to take back their culture from the British.
Yeah,
So you
of
think
course.
it
Absolutely.
was partly political as well.
Yes, I would say so. I would say so.
Wow.
Because again, she was a person who wanted very deeply, this was one thing she wanted to do, which was create a kind of a mystery school setup, which would be completely ecumenical, where East meets West. And this, of course, went against the agenda of the ruling elites who think that they're just the biggest honchos and that the East is just full of a bunch of pygmies that they can push about. And therefore, they didn't want somebody from the occult world coming who's going to unite man, in a religious or spiritual way. This is something they couldn't tolerate at all.
Hmm. Wow. There's also a theory that the Theosophists communicated with these ascended masters through the use of astral projection. Is this true, or is this a fraudulent claim, or what was going on with that?
Well, I come from the Krishnamurti school, so we have no time for that at all. Whether it's even, I think it is true. I've read deeply on the subject, and I do believe that these forces, let's say, exist, and it is very possible for people in what is known as lower psychicism to be contacted by these beings. There's lots and lots of evidence for this. It's a well-known phenomena that when you start to open your mind, and we're not just talking about Blavatsky here, let's just keep general about spiritualism in general, and that is that when you start to open your mind or as the Vedic people would say, when you start to work with the Kundalini or open the chakras or whatever, sort of vernacular you want to use. And this, by the way, this very much goes for those who think that taking ayahuasca and all these other things is also a backdoor into this. When you start to do this, I don't think that people have even the foggiest idea of the danger that they're in. I think was it you and I we spoke before about whether or not I support drug use or whatever it was. I think
yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And I thought a lot about that. I usually try not to publicly even, make statements like that. And by the way, to the guy in the chat room who wanted to talk about Freeman, see, what the main reason why I don't is because I, of my own case, do not publicly speak about the work of other people. Whether I like those people or I don't, I never comment on the work of other people. All I do is suggest that people research what interests them, study it for themselves, and then come to their own conclusions. Because I get this email about 200 times a month, but what do you think of this guy? Or what do you think about Bill Cooper? Or what do you think about this? Or what do you think about that? I've bent the rule a little bit when it's personal associates like Jordan Maxwell and other people of the past who are now dead and gone. But, it's not my job to be some sort of agony aunt or opinion maker. I'm not a journalist, and I'm not going to tell people, what I think of this person and that person, and load on them my own personal things. And this also goes for this topic as well. But I will say this, that I do believe that people have the absolute right to take drugs and go on these experiences and do what they want. But I will also say that they also need to realize that there's really great dangers. And I say this because I know how many people have been destroyed by doing this kind of thing. And it ties into your question. So when a person opens their minds, opens their psyche, and if people have read my Disciples of the Mysterium article, I go into this whole concept with extreme depth and talk about, neurotic behavior and various components of the ego. In very broad terms, I'd say that the Mysterium is a sort of a darker side of the ego, and again, we're keeping it very simple here. And therefore there are dangers. And when people have met these forces, and you can even meet them because of deprivation, people who've been locked up in cells or dungeons, people who've had food deprivation, people in the desert, there's all sorts of ways in which you can sort of enter into that world, of course. Trauma is one way. Listen to what Arizona Wilder, Kathy O'Brien have said. The elite know how to traumatize you to a certain extent, where your mind will also be, opened to these other sort of aspects of the self, the darker aspects of consciousness and what have you. And again, if we tie that into the fact that consciousness as we know it is extremely young and very fragile and vulnerable, this all makes sense. So then what happens when a person, for any number of reasons, tries to open their consciousness to something that is preternatural or even pan-dimensional or whatever you want to call it? I personally think there's real dangers in this. And then I also say that you don't need to. My philosophy is you don't need to do that because man is the highest of all things. He doesn't really need to be, sort of like some sort of a, Alibaba trying to find some open sesame, to some sort of arcane knowledge. It's already at his fingertips. There's other ways to attain this. And as I said, coming from the Krishnamurti school, we have no time at all for any of these distractions, be they internal or external, just in the same way that I don't support any external authority. Well, there's internal authorities as well. And what happens is when people have taken this road, when they belong to these societies that specialize in this kind of thing, they're going to meet these forces, and then they've been called angels, they've been called demons, they've been called daemons, they've been called archons. You see, you're into this whole realm. And I just think that it's very deadly, and there's been so much disaster and fallout. However, I will admit that, yeah, they exist. They're there. There's something there, although I take a Jungian standpoint and say I ultimately believe that these are aspects of consciousness. They're not so much objective realities any more than there's a red devil with horns running around somewhere, so I don't believe that. I believe they're subjective. I believe a lot of this is about aspects of the psyche that we don't understand. And if people read the Disciples of the Mysterium and watch the DVD that's coming out, they'll get more of an understanding of what I mean by that. Of course, that's arguable. A lot of people do believe these are actually objective entities or whatever, and of course we can all always argue that point,
That's really interesting that you said that. We recently had a shaman on who gave the complete opposite perspective. A couple of weeks down the line, we're going to have Pastor Tex Mars on to give us a Christian perspective. And that's why I love doing the radio show, because I get to hear so many different perspectives and put them all out on the table and let the audience really decide what works best for them.
Well, don't forget that I would include Christianity as a spiritualism.